Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session. Thanks for joining us. My name is Joe Brady, and I'm the host today for a session that's going to cover some things that I know are driving a lot of you absolutely nuts, and that's the whole concept of blending electronic flash outdoors with ambient light. So let's get right into it. Now, for many photographers, from novice to experienced, the concept of mixing flash and ambient light in portrait photography is a subject that causes your blood to run cold. I've seen this. Whenever I hear a photographer say, I prefer to use natural light, what I'm really hearing is, I have no idea how to control my flash. When forced to use flash in such conditions, if it's not something you're used to, a lot of times what happens is you get images that are at best barely acceptable, but they look like snapshots with bright faces and no shape. So no wonder the concept seems scary. The goal of today's presentation is to take away the mystery of blending flash with ambient light and give you complete control to craft the portraits you want. Now, there are a couple of tools that you need to add to your photo toolkit to make this process both simple and repeatable. Besides our camera and flash, obviously, the other two items we're going to need are radio triggers to fire the flash and a light meter to measure the light from both the ambient and the flash contributions. These tools are going to allow you to concentrate on your subject and put you in control of the quality and the shape of the light. Now, first let me talk about the radio triggers. I mentioned this first. Radio triggers allow you to get your flash off the camera. Now, that's really the first step towards getting beautiful portraits. Really, if you stop and think about it, flash fired right from the top of the camera is generally fairly dreadful. Think about it. We've got this direct light coming right into the face. That's not how we typically see people, unless we're interviewing them with maybe a miner's helmet with a lamp on it, or you're interviewing them in some kind of crime scene drama. In order to consistently get our flashes to fire while in the sunlight, we need radio triggers to get them off camera and tell the flash when to fire. Now, it's true that many cameras have built-in infrared triggering systems, or you can use the pop-up flash to fire your lights. But those systems don't fare too well in bright sunlight, and they need direct line of sight to work, so you know hiding your flash behind a tree or around a corner. I'm using a Pocket Wizard Plus 3s to fire my lights. These are really simple to use. They're very reliable, and they make the process of off-camera flash an absolute joy. The other item we need is a light meter. A light meter allows you to measure both the ambient and flash contributions. Now, I've got two with me today. I've got a Sekonic L358 here and a Sekonic 758DR here. Both of these meters add an important function to our goals today. They'll both tell you the percentage of flash that is being added to the ambient light. Now, if you have a meter that doesn't do that, I know there's some of you out there that have meters like the Sekonic 308S. We'll cover some ways that will get you most of the way there, but these will really give you absolute information so that you can consistently create exactly the same ratios. Now, this is really important information if you want consistent results. You're going to find that you like a specific percentage of flash to ambient light. Something that fills in the shadows, adds a little bit of catch light to your subject eyes, but doesn't look too much like a flash photograph. Now, in most cases, you'll probably find that a percentage of flash to ambient, somewhere between 20 to 40%, is going to produce the most pleasing and subtle results. This is, of course, subjective, and it's going to vary depending on the conditions and the mood that you're after. Now, we're going to see images today that show the flash contribution from anywhere from 0 to 90%. What's important is that you know how to create these results when you want, so you can get the portrait you're after. Now, the first thing that can really help you is getting to know your flash. Knowing how much light your flash puts out at different power settings and distances can really help make this process much easier. Now, this is pretty easy to measure, so I'm going to invite you to try these steps. In a room that is somewhat dim, I'm going to bring my flash over here. Now, first of all, by the way, I should mention, everything we're doing is complete manual. We're not doing anything TTL because we need to control these percentages. We don't want the flash to try to figure it out. We're going to figure it out. So when I turn my flash on, I'm set for manual, and I'm set right now for quarter power. That's a good place to start because it gives you some room to either increase or decrease power. So what I recommend is put your flash about 8 feet away from your position. And I'm going to turn on my Pocket Wizard here, and I have channel 6 on there. I've got channel 6 on my camera, but both the meters I'm using also have Pocket Wizard transmitters in it. If not, You can also fire your flash with your second pocket wizard and the meter will read it that way. But let me just turn this on and I'm going to set it. I'm using 160 ISO because that's what we did mostly when we were out shooting. 125th of a second. Let's take a look and see at about 8 feet away what contribution my flash is giving me. And let me take a little step back. That was a little close. That was about 6 feet. So from 8 feet away, I'm getting F8. That's a good thing to know. Now, if you're getting less than that, if you're getting 5, 6 or less, you might want to increase your power maybe from a quarter to a half. I'd also repeat that process with an umbrella or softbox if that's something you commonly want to use. Also, if you need a lot more flash or need a lot more distance, you might want to try to repeat that at ISO 640. That'll give you a reference with the sensor 2 stops more sensitive. This knowledge is going to give you a good starting point for placement, distance, and where you're going to put it for your subject. Now, this is really important to know. Now, I'm almost 6 feet tall, a little short. I know that my wingspan is about 6 feet. So judging 8 feet is pretty easy. I can just come out to about here. And again, I just point my flash or my meter back at my flash and I get my F8 reading. You're going to find one step closer is going to change the contribution of your flash by in about 10% increments. So if I'm at 20% flash from back here and I want to increase it to 30%, really just one step's going to do it. We're going to explore this some more and I'll take some questions about it because this part can be confusing, but it is really very simple. Now, even though I'm in the studio and it's fairly bright here, we're still getting pretty much close to 100% of the flash contribution. So you don't need to be in a completely darkened room. Just dim the lights a little bit. Once you know what your flash will put out at that 8-foot distance, that's something you can always repeat. And we'll see that put to use when we're out shooting. Now, a couple different situations we're going to explore today, blending flash and ambient light. First, you've got a subject in bright shade. Behind them, bright or variable daylight background. Secondly, we're going to go to a spot that's in full shade with a very dark background. That's probably actually the easiest one to control. Third, subject in the shade with a full sun, really bright background. That's a tough one, creates a little more challenge. And then lastly, the subject in the full sun. Now you might think that, well, full sun, that's something you really want to avoid. Actually, using fill flash, it actually can be very easy to control. Now, each of these situations might also benefit from different ratios of flash to ambient light, and that's one of the elements we're going to explore today. Now, I want to cover a little bit of basics before we go on. This might be real basic for some of you, but bear with me. Let's discuss the factors that will influence our portrait images in these situations. You may be familiar with the exposure triangle. We're going to expand that idea to include our flash. Now, some of this may be basic to you, but it's important to review. So let's take a look at the exposure quintet. Now, before we start blending our flash with the ambient light, let's have a quick discussion about the 5 elements that will determine both the exposure and the ratio of flash to the ambient light. Now, you may be familiar with the exposure triangle, but we're going to talk about the exposure quintet because when you add a flash into the mix, 2 more variables come into play. Now, this may be review for some of you, but stay with me for a minute. Let's start out with ISO. Now, ISO is basically the sensitivity of the sensor. The higher the number, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. The result is that 200 ISO is twice as sensitive as 100 ISO. So, what's the downside? Well, higher ISO does mean higher noise. Now, it's true that today's cameras have remarkable high ISO performance, but there's always going to be a penalty. If you've got any dark areas in the image, you're going to start to see some noise. Now, yes, of course, image editing, including Adobe Camera Raw, Lightroom, Aperture, etc., can reduce noise, but you're going to lose some sharpness and detail when you do that. Lowest ISO is always going to give you the best result. There really is no free lunch here, but let's take a look at some examples. So I just walked out the other day and I actually took a picture of the front of the Mac Group building in North White Plains, New York. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in at 200% to this area where we see the Mac Group logo on the door. Now here we see 2 examples, same distance, same frame, just shot at different ISOs. And you can see the 640 ISO image on the left, zoomed into 200%, is much cleaner than the image shot at ISO 1250. Now this even gets worse as we go up. Look at 2500 ISO. You can see it's getting very grainy. Now, you'd think 640 is a fairly safe low ISO, but when we compare the 640 ISO image to a 160 ISO image, you can see how much of that grain and noise has disappeared. Like I said, there's no free lunch. The higher the ISO, there's going to be a penalty in noise. Now, next is aperture. Now, in aperture, a larger number means a smaller opening. Typically, full stops on lenses run in a sequence 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, and 22. Now, in this case, the larger number to the right means that half of the light is entering through the lens to the shutter. For example, f8 is twice the amount of light coming in as f11. Now, each halving or doubling the amount of light hitting the sensor is called one full f-stop, or more commonly, one stop. In our f8 case, if we wanted to open up one stop with the aperture, we would change from f8 to 5.6. Now, smaller apertures have greater depth of field than more open apertures, which may or may not be something that you're after depending on the scene. Shutter speed. Now that seems fairly straightforward. Really, the longer opening lets in more light, so that 125th of a second exposure lets in twice as much light as a 250th of a second exposure, which would be, again, one stop difference. Now, most cameras default to both shutter speed and apertures in 1/3 stop increments. That allows you to get a little more finely tuned exposures. Shutter speed is what controls ambient light. Your flash duration is actually very short. It's much shorter than the actual sync speed, which is probably on your camera of 1/200th or 1/250th of a second, where your flash is going to be on for maybe 1,000th of a second or less. If you take a shot at 250th of a second, your flash is going to put out the exact same amount of light at 250th of a second or a 15th of a second. Again, the shutter speed is going to affect the ambient light coming in. Flash power seems, again, straightforward, very linear. If you have your flash on manual set at 1/4 power, it's half as much power as half power. However, what's really changing is not the flash intensity, but the flash duration. At 1/2 power, the flash is on for twice as long. There's a benefit. Let's say if you were maybe photographing hummingbirds and you really wanted to try to stop that movement of the wings, lower power on your flash is going to be much less duration and have better stopping power of fast action. Now, distance to the subject, if you're not familiar with the inverse square rule, might not be as straightforward as you think. If you double the distance of the flash to the subject, you're going to change the power by 1/4. So let's take a look at that. So here we have our model, and we have the correct exposure with the flash set at 1/4 power. So let's say we're 8 feet away from the model at 1/4 power, we get a perfect exposure. Now, if we double the distance from 8 to 16 feet, it's not putting half the amount of light on our subject, it's putting 1/4 of the amount of light. So if we take that shot without changing any settings, we end up with an image that's going to be 2 stops underexposed because it's 1/4 of the amount of light. So we need more light. So what do we have to do? We've got to adjust one of the variables, our ISO, or we have to increase the power on the flash. So if we're going to double the distance, we're going to need 4 times the amount of light. Now remember, our flash was set at 1/4 power, so if we change from 1/4 power to full power, which is 2 full stops, then we get the correct exposure back on our subject. When you learn to get these elements under control, it's really going to make things much easier. It's going to get your equipment out of the way and allow you to focus on getting the correct shot of your subject. So we're going to explore this a lot more through the course of the day. All right, so we had some questions come through, and great questions, by the way. Thank you for these. First of all, and this is one that I know comes up for those of you who already have meter. Somebody asked, how do you figure out F values on your meter into your camera? For example, I know a lot of you have your meter set that they're reading in tenths of a stop. So whoever asked this question said the meter says 5.6.7, so 5, 6, and 7 tenths. Question is, does that mean 2/3 of a stop between 5, 6, and 8? And how would I set that on the camera? Good question. What I'd recommend you do with both of these meters, in fact any of your meters, to match them to your camera, unless you're doing studio kind of stuff, I'd probably want to have the meter set in 1/3 of a stop. And it's handled differently depending on the meter. On a Sekonic 358, it's actually done with the dip switches in the back of the meter. And Rick, if you can zoom in on here. Let's get that focused in. So you see these dip switches right here. So if you have the first one down and then the rest of them up, that will make the meter read out in thirds of a stop. So you don't have to do that translating. 7/10 would be 2/3 of a stop. So what is 7/10 up from 5/6? 5/6, 6/3, F7, then F8. So F7 would be 5/6 and 2/3. That's a lot to figure out. So it's a lot easier to just set your meter in thirds, and that's how I have mine set. If you have a 758, it's a custom function. And when you got a 758, if you have one, there was a little sticker that came with it that I would put on the inside of the battery cover. And if you look, it says custom function number 3, if you set it to 1, it reads in thirds of a stop. And you access the custom functions on a 758 by turning it on while holding in the mode button. So if I hold in the mode button and power on, it goes right to the custom functions. Let me angle this so you can see it a little better. And you see there's 1. So if I go to 2, 3, you see it if I have it set for 1. If I keep hitting the mode button, it will cycle through. So 0, 1, 2. So custom function 3 set for 1 sets the 758 into thirds of a stop. That just makes it real easy because the numbers on your readout will exactly match the third increments on your camera. So good question. Let's see, there were a couple other good questions here. Somebody asked what ISO did I test at. The base ISO I typically shoot on my camera, and my primary camera is a Canon 7D. I use 160 ISO as my base. If you're primarily shooting at 100 or 200, use that for your test. Someone asked, does anyone know if a Pocket Wizard can fire a Quantum Trio Basic? Well, again, I'm using the Pocket Wizard Plus 3s. The beauty of these is they'll fire anything. You can use any flash pretty much with any camera on this because they're doing one simple thing. They're just telling that light out there to fire. We're not doing any TTL, it's just a fire command. If you have a flash that does not have a sync adapter in it, I've got a Canon 580 EX2 right here. You can see right on the side it's got a sync port, and that's connected to my Plus 3. But I could use any flash on here. And I've got some old Vivitar 283s around. I have a 10-year-old Nikon SB28DX. I mix them all together because they're just flashers. They're putting out light. When they're on manual, I'm controlling how much is going out. It really is that simple. Another really good question. Somebody asked, what impact will the zoom settings on the flash have as far as the percentage of flash to ambient? Excellent question. On the camera, on the back of the flash, there's also a zoom setting. On the Canon, again, it's in the upper right. It's going to vary flash to flash, and not every flash has this feature. I have mine set to 50 millimeters, which is kind of the same as my eyesight. I generally find that works, and that's generally what I test. There's not as much variation as you'd think, changing from 50 to 28 or even going higher. Yes, it narrows or widens the beam of light, but I haven't found the exposure to vary that much, but 50 millimeter rather, is where I'm at. Good question. Another question was dome in, dome out. Get this all the time. Except when I'm in the studio and I'm measuring individual contributions of just the flash, my dome is going to stay out. Because I want to take advantage of the three-dimensionality of the dome. When I'm mirroring a face, let's say the sun is coming from, say, over in this direction. Well, you can't see that. I pointed off the screen. It's coming from over there. I'll put the dome from the face back towards the camera. This way, the dome is being illuminated just like the face is. There's part of it slightly in shadow, part in bright sun. So by doing that, the dome is mirroring how the light is hitting the face. So dome out. The only time I go dome in like this is in the studio, and I want to measure the individual contributions of light. Okay? Good questions. Let's see. So again, as I mentioned, I'm using the Pocket Wizard Plus 3s. Beauty is they work with everything. Any flash, any combination of camera and flash, doesn't matter. It's a simple single pin that's just telling your lights to fire. Let's see. Any other questions that we had here? Okay. Somebody asked, why do I recommend 10th increments in studio? It depends. That's a subject for another day. In fact, we're going to do studio photography coming up. And it depends on what the subject is wearing. I may be concerned about tenths if, say, I have a bride in a dress, and I really want to push that white right to the edge, but I don't want to clip it. But in general, I do stick to thirds. Let's see. A couple other questions that actually will apply after our next video segment, so I will get to those shortly. Now, someone asked, can I use the built-in light meter in my camera? Oh, good question. And that's really why we're here today. Your light meter has a lot of limitations. Your camera is simply measuring the light that's coming through the lens. It's reflected back into the camera. It's a reflective reading. So it's influenced by a couple of things. One, what's the subject wearing? Two, what's the elements in the background? What's going on? If I take a picture of a subject against a dark background, the camera's going to give me a very different reading than if I did it against a light background. And you're going to see that a little later. Also, the camera can only measure the total amount of light coming into the camera. It can't tell us the percentage of the flash to ambient. That's what this does. This is measuring the light falling on the scene. Doesn't care what color things are, doesn't care light or dark. It's just going to measure the light hitting the scene, and it's going to be consistent that way. But great question, and that's what we're going to explore even more. So let's start with our first lighting challenge. We're going to go to New York City for a little trip. We did this last week at a really fun shoot. We have our subject in bright shade with a background that's fairly closely matched, but variable because the sun kept peeking out from the clouds. Now, this same situation might also apply if your subject is maybe photographed by a window in kind of a bright room with a light outdoor scene in the background. It's going to be a similar situation. So, as I mentioned, we did a location shoot in New York City last week. Let's take a visit to the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art as we started our day of portraits. First thing I'm going to do is just take a measurement of the ambient and see what the meter tells me. Now, she's kind of in shadow because we've got a lot of tall buildings around. And to meter like this, since I want her face exposed correctly, I'm going to meter with the dome pointing away from her face. I'm not going to meter the light falling on her because that's going to leave this too much in shadow. In essence, I want the dome to mirror kind of the shape of her face because that's how the sun is hitting her. So at 160 ISO, I get 125 at f8. So let me just dial that in and go to 125 at f8 before the sun pops out. And just get my shot. And exposure's fine, it's a little bland, her face is in shadow. Now, I know ahead of time that my light at quarter power from 8 feet away puts out about f8 worth of light. So I'm at f8 already. If I add f8 from here, what it's going to do is duplicate the ambient light and fill in some of the shadows and look very natural. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to meter that. So same thing. This difference is now I'm going to have Jen, our lovely voice-activated light stand today, and she's just going to point the flash at Bethany over here. So I'll come over here, take my reading, and it went deeper into shadow. One more time. All right, so now I'm getting 125 at f9. It added 1/3 of a stop, and it also tells me that's a 30% flash contribution. That's a nice amount. It's going to light her up a bit since she's in shadow. So I just go to f9, and now we get the same image, this time with our flash. The shadows are filled in nicely. We've got a nice catch light in Bethany's eyes, and it really is that simple. So what I'm going to do is bring it up to about 40% contribution. And with just having Jen take one small step in, that's going to increase the percentage of flash to ambient. So let's take another meter reading. And it's exactly what happened. We're at 125 at f10, but now the flash is 40%. So we added another 1/3 of a stop to our exposure. Beautiful. Now, since this light is kind of directional, let me just get Jen over here before the sun comes in. Just kind of point it right on the left side of her face. Kept the distance, I just changed the angle a little bit. Nice. Now what's happening is the sun's peeking in and out of the clouds. So every once in a while, the background behind Bethany is lighting up. Since the flash is now providing 40% of the light, it's going to be much less of a harsh transition. It's going to look a lot more natural. Now you can see the sun starting to peek out behind. The stones behind her are starting to open up. If I let the camera do the metering, that's going to fool it. It's going to end up making her even darker in shadow. In fact, let's do that one first. You can pretty much guarantee it's not going to be good. And yeah, it's exactly what happens. Since there's no flash, now the light on her is very flat. There's kind of shadows. So we need to do something to open that up. So once again, we're just going to bring our flash in So let's get you a little bit more flat on, about right there. I'm going to take another meter reading. All right, so at there, I'm at 1/25 at f11, and now it's 50% contribution, because Jen's a little bit closer and it's a little more directional. Let's give that a try. I don't know if I'm going to like that much contribution of flash. 50% is getting to be a lot. It's going to start to look like we're using flash, but let's see what happens anyway. Let's actually light into the part of her hair. So let's come on over this side. So what we're going to do is, this time, we're going to light this side of her face. I'm going to move over a little bit, so we'll end up having a little bit more of a short lighting on her. So if you can just look this way a little bit. Jen, you're going to point the flash right here. Come around a little bit more, not closer, right there. All right, so let me go ahead and meter that. And we're back to 1/25 of a second at f11, and that's a 40% contribution, which should be pretty good. So let's go ahead and do that. So tilt your head a little bit. Come on, give me one of your Bethany looks. And nice, even better. Beautiful. Now it's almost like we're almost getting kind of studio lighting here. All right. Keep the questions coming through. These are great questions. Thank you for that. By the way, if you did join us late, join the chat room, because the questions are coming through there and they're ending up right here on my iPad, so I get to answer them. So, first thing, let's make something really clear. A couple of you asked, is my camera on matrix metering or spot metering or whatever? The answer is, it doesn't matter. I'm not using my camera's meter at all. My camera is on full manual. That's where we're letting this meter tell us what we should be set at. I'm on full manual. My ISO is set for 160. My shutter speed is variable depending on where I want the background, which we'll see in a little bit. And this tells me what my shutter speed and my f-stop should be. So the camera metering doesn't matter. Typically, I leave it on matrix. If it's backlit, I might go to center weighted or spot, but I don't use my camera's meter all that much. I pretty much travel everywhere with my, my handheld meter. Somebody asked, another interesting question. Somebody asked that families want the photo in front of mountains with the sun setting behind them. Really hard to expose for the background and get the fill flash correct. Any tips? 2 more segments. That's actually a video exactly that. You've got somebody basically in shade, which is kind of the same thing as having them backlit. And yes, it is difficult to overcome. You might need to add some lights, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Someone else asked that their flash and camera sync at 200th of a second. Wanted to take a portrait of a girl under shade and expose for the background at f4 ISO 100. However, f4 will blow out the highlights. Can I properly expose the background without changing my shutter speed? The answer to that really is no. Either your shutter speed or your ISO are going to have to change. We'll talk about that also as we're coming up. Somebody mentioned they're using a 430EX Canon flash, and they can adjust the zoom. Is it better to use wide or narrow flash beam? It really depends on your subject. If it's just a single person, I'd put it somewhere in the middle, somewhere wider to mid. I typically have mine set at 50 millimeters. It depends on the distance to the subject too. Remember, with the inverse square rule, when you start getting a lot further away than 8 feet, if you've got your flash 15 feet away, you're not going to be putting out all that much light, so you're probably going to want to have it pretty beamed in at that point. I generally have my flash 8 to 10 feet away from the subject. So I do keep the zoom at around 50 millimeters. Somebody asked about calibrating meters. Really a subject for another day. Actually, if you go onto the Sekonic website, there is a software called DTS where I go over how to calibrate a 758. I kind of cheated. I actually calibrated my 358 to my 758, but we'll cover that on the website shortly. Let's see. Oh, someone asked, okay, I understand flash contribution has a lot to do with the look you're looking to create. What percentage do I like to shoot at? Depends on the scene somewhat. In general, I like somewhere between 20 and 30% flash contribution. At that point, you can barely see it. Really what it's doing is filling in the shadows, but 30%, even 25 to 30% puts a really nice catch light in the eyes and adds a sparkle and really opens up the eye. So I do really like that. Someone asked, In the shoot that you just saw, the one we were on the steps in the Metropolitan, could a reflector have been used instead of a flash? Yes and no. Yes, a reflector would take some of the background ambient and fill in a little bit. The problem was there was no direct sun, so it would be hard to use a reflector to really get the fill we want, and we're certainly not going to have the ability to create a catch light. There are some shoots that we're going to see shortly where a reflector probably would have worked pretty well, but I like the control of the flash. And again, you're missing the catch lights. Let's see. Somebody asked, do I use any filters to match the flash and ambient light? Actually, in general, I do not. I use a color checker passport to create a custom white balance, which I did not show today, but that was actually the first thing we did before we started. The flash color temperature is actually pretty close to daylight. It comes in at about 5500 K. So with a 30% contribution versus the sun, generally daylight is going to match very nicely. So that also answers the question of the color of the flash versus the ambient light. When we're out in sun, again with the flash giving us 20 to 30% flash contribution, the color temperature pretty much matches. It might have a slight warming effect to it, but generally for skin tones that's always nice. Okay, anything else? Oh, one last question. Someone asked, what autofocus settings do I use? Good question. I know a lot of people like to play with the autofocus and pick a side where they're going to have the focus point. I'm old school on this. I use a single focus point dead center in my camera. I will then focus on that point, typically on the eye that's closest to me, and then I reframe with the shutter depressed halfway. That way I know that eye is in focus, and that's really what I care about, and then I can reframe anywhere I want. I don't rely on all the focusing segments in the camera. I'm old school that way. If you like to use the camera for focusing, go for it. I like just the one center point. It all comes down to knowing your equipment and keeping it from getting in the way. That's really the biggest thing. Okay, so let's continue on. So as you saw from our shoot, I think it's already quite plain to see the benefits of being able to control the amount of flash you use outdoors. Yeah, with a lot of editing in Lightroom or Photoshop, I might have been able to get similar results. I could have added a catch light, I could have brightened up one side of her face, but it certainly would have been a lot of work, and our goal is to get it right in camera. Now, we also saw that knowing the approximate power of your flash at a fixed distance, again, in my case, quarter power at 8 feet with an ISO of 160 gives me f8. So, for example, let's say you have a meter that does not give you the percentages, and you kind of want to be in the 30% range. Well, if I take an ambient reading, and I get f11, and I place my flash at quarter power 8 feet away, that's adding f8. f8 is one stop less than f11. So 2/3 of the light's coming from the ambient, 1/3 from the flash. That's going to put you very close to 30%. So if you have a meter that doesn't do the percentage, knowing those contributions will get you there. Again, I take an ambient reading at f16. I still know my flash is going to put out f8 at 8 feet away. Now it's putting out a quarter or so. So I know that contribution in that case would be between 20 and 25%. So that's a way to do it if you don't have a meter that tells you exactly. So let's move on. Our next location had very different conditions. We started walking through the park from the Metropolitan Museum of Art right across to Natural History on the other side. We were in full deep shade with a very dark background. This kind of situation actually gives you probably the most flexibility because you have a large amount of control. You're really controlling where the light's coming from. This spot was also a perfect example of how the shutter speed determines the brightness of the background. Since we were only using one small light, this is all we were traveling with. In fact, I didn't even pack a light stand. You see that Jen was holding the light for us. I didn't have any extra light to illuminate the surrounding areas. Because the ambient light level was low, and this is a really important point to remember, changing the shutter speed is what changes the ambient exposure, not the flash contribution. Your flash has a duration of, 500th of a second or less, and it goes down dramatically as you bring down the power. This means that the amount of flash in your shot is going to be exactly the same at 250th of a second as it is at a 15th of a second. You also might be amazed at how slow a shutter speed you can get away with when hand holding your camera if the flash is providing a lot of the light. And this is happening because of the short duration of this flash. It freezes movement as long as the ambient light is low. So let's continue our stroll in Central Park and see how this concept works. By the way, and I'll actually mention this in the video clip, this same type of situation occurs if you're photographing a wedding. If you're doing a reception shots in a dark reception hall, same kind of thing. The flash is providing most of the light. When I'm shooting a wedding reception, the shutter speed on my camera is typically around 1/15 of a second because the flash is going to stop the movement. The background, the far background is out of focus anyway, so it doesn't matter if my camera blurs it a little more. So let's take a look. We're going to do something in full shade, which means the ambient light isn't going to be contributing a whole heck of a lot. So we're going to actually use the flash, kind of like in a studio situation. So first thing I'm going to do is take an ambient reading. And it's pretty dim in here. At 160, I'm getting 2.8 at 1/80th of a second. So the flash is definitely going to be the primary light. And let's see how that looks. I mean, it'll be okay. Either bring your hand all the way around, actually bring your hand around, that's better. There we go. Her face is a bit in shadow, so it's time to bring out the flash. At 8 feet away, and my arm span's a little short of 6 feet, so a little bit 2 feet beyond my hand, will be f8, which is going to be too much since we're shooting at 2.8. So come on over here, Jen. So we're going to get Jen 8 feet away. That's 6 feet. There's 8 feet away, about. Now, f8, 2.8. 2.8 to 4, 4 to 5, 6, 5, 6 to 8. That means this is going to be 3 stops brighter. It's going to be really harsh. In fact, let's just go ahead and do it, just so we can see what it looks like. So point right here over at Bethany. And, interesting, at 1/80th of a second, we get 6.3, because now the flash is contributing 80% of the light, which is really a crazy amount of light. So let's go ahead and do that, just so we have an example. Here we go, you ready? Beautiful. It's actually kind of an interesting look. Obviously the flash was used. It's kind of dramatic. So one of the things about knowing the percentage of flash to ambient is you get to decide the kind of look that you want. If I want to make the background even darker, I can increase my shutter speed, and it's going to make this probably close to 100%. So we're going to try that. If I go up to 200th of a second at 6.3, the flash contribution is then going to be 90%. It's almost entirely flash at this point, and the background is going to get really dark. So let's give that a try. So again, I'm still at 6.3, but now my shutter speed is at 200th of a second. And yeah, now it looks like it's nighttime and we just have a flash illuminating Bethany. Again, it's a look, I don't particularly like it, but you can give it a try. To soften the shadows a little bit, I'm just going to ask Jen to come around this way a little, about right there. Again, her distance to Bethany hasn't changed. What's changed is just the angle, so we'll get a little more light on this side of her face. Yeah, again, interesting. I don't necessarily like it. Let's get a full length. And yeah, it looks like she's standing in midnight. In fact, I can show you. Take a look. Looks like you're, even though it's daytime. So I'm going to do the same thing again, except now I'm going to back down to 1/80th of a second again. And at 6.3. And now let's see what that looks like. All right, now the background is starting to lighten up a bit. Although it's kind of, it's not a bad look, but it still looks very flashy. Since we're shooting at fairly wide open, the background's kind of blurry anyway, and since the flash is providing so much of the light, I can continue to drop my shutter speed fairly low. In fact, when I shoot weddings at a reception, my camera's typically at 1/15th of a second or so, because the flash duration is so short. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to open up the background again. So I'm going to go a full stop. So I'm going to go from 1/80th of a second to 1/40th of a second. So that's going to open up the background a full stop. But the light on you is going to be the same. So let's take a look and see what that does. And yeah, that's decidedly nicer. You can see here. In fact, you can see the difference.
Big difference.
One for the other. So by going down to 1/40th of a second, the light on her hasn't really changed. What's changed is the background, which I'm controlling with the shutter speed. I'm going to go even a little further. I'm going to open up at 1/20th of a second, and we'll see how sharp it holds. Actually, I want to see what the ambient light percentage is at 1/20th of a second. Oh, another murder in New York. Let's see. At 1/20th of a second, we're now at f8, the flash is now 40% of the contribution. That means we got 60% ambient light. 20th of a second is pushing it, trying to handhold that. I don't think I'm gonna be able to keep that sharp, but let's try it anyway. And yeah, I don't know how sharp it is because trying to hold the camera at 20th of a second, you gotta do that, use a tripod. I traveled very light today. Let me go ahead and zoom in though. Let's see how sharp this is. Actually, it's pretty damn sharp. Okay, it worked. So even at a 20th of a second with 40% of the flash, it held pretty still. And what's really nice is even though the light is fairly even, look at the nice catch lights we got. Yeah. So it's a nice little catch light in our eye, which really opens things up. All right, so let's do a couple more shots, and then since the sun, it seems to be just about ready to come out full, then we'll move over to the castles. All right, some more good questions. A couple people are asking, there's still some confusion about where the percentage of flash contribution shows up. So let's do that again. Let me bring up my meter. Let me just power it on here. And let me turn my flash back on. All right. So I'm gonna put my flash right here, and I'll ask Rick to zoom in after we do this. I'm gonna step back about 8 feet. I'm gonna point back to the flash. And I got F9 there. Let me back a little more. Okay, so I got F8. So Rick, I'm going to ask you to zoom in on here. See if I can hold it fairly steady. Let's get it focused. Okay, so I think you can see right there in the upper right-hand corner, it says 90%. So that's saying in this room with the ambient light, I've got 1/25th of a second at F8. The flash contribution is 90%. Now remember, the ambient light is changed by the shutter speed. So if I start changing the shutter speed reading, let me bring it down, you'll see when I start getting low enough, that number is going to change. So if I go down to, you can see 1/10 of a second, now you can see that the contribution is 60%, sorry. Now it's 60% flash instead of 90% flash. So by changing the shutter speed, the ambient light is going to change. Now if I just wanted to take an ambient reading, I need to just change the mode. So I want to get over to the first button, which is the little sunshine thing. So there is my ambient reading. That would just be ambient. Moving left to right from there, the next one over is flash where it's waiting. So let me back up a second. If you've got a flash that doesn't have a pocket wizard trigger in it, that's okay, because they will all the flash meters will do this. You put it on this meter, this next one over with just a little lightning bolt, and that means it's going to wait for a flash. It'll actually, once I hit the read button, it waits for 90 seconds. So in that case, if I don't have a transmitter or a cable running from here, I can simply point the meter back at the flash, hit the button. Oh, let me turn off my, let's see if it'll, yeah, okay. So I hit the button. Then I can trigger the remote flash with my pocket wizard just by hitting the test button, and then it will give me the reading. And I get the same exact reading. So if you have a meter that does not have the transmitter in it, if you have a 308 or a 508 or something like that, just use the pocket wizard that's on your camera, hit the test button, the meter again will wait for 90 seconds to see a flash. Hope I made that clear. If not, ask the question again and I'll come back to it. Let's see. Oh, somebody asked about the mount on the light stand. I do frequently travel with a small light stand. This is just a simple umbrella mount. You can get them at any camera store. It's got a cold shoe adapter on it, which is just to hold the flash. You'll find them anywhere from 10 to 15 bucks. Just do a search online. They're all over the place. Let's see. Somebody asked about the switches when measuring ambient light. Again, the switches I have my 358 set for are down, up, up, up. That has my meter in thirds of a stop. The ambient light setting is simply activated by going over to the sun icon on the front of the screen. And when I go there, I have two ambient metering modes. One is shutter speed priority, and the other is aperture priority. and they both will work the same way. And again, once you take a reading, you can spin the dial and see various different combinations. Oh, let's see. So yes, if you have a 508, you can use sync cables, or don't even use sync cables. Just hit it on the mode where it's waiting, fire your flash, and it will wait for 90 seconds to see a flash. So both the 358 and the 758 show you the percentage of flash to ambient in the upper right-hand corner. Now, of course, they don't show you that when it's just an ambient reading, only when you fire a flash. And someone asked about cross-lighting for sports portraits. Subject for another day. When we get to environmental portraits and studio portraits, we will cover that, because I'm going to actually go into shooting portraits in order to composite them in a completely different background that they're not really even in. Someone asked, do I normally use a flash without a modifier? If I'm out in bright sun, yes, I don't bother with a modifier, because the flash is just going to add that little bit of percentage. If I was in a situation like we just saw in that full shade, yes, I would typically either bring in some more lights. I'd start to use some light shaping tools like an umbrella, although I prefer a softbox. Since the flash in that case is providing a large percentage of the light, I would want to have a little more control. And I will cover that in our next upcoming session, which is environmental portraiture, and then we'll get into multiple lights and light shaping tools. Someone asked about the flash. This happens to be a Canon 580EX2, but as I mentioned, since everything we're doing is manual, my camera's on manual, my flash is on manual, everything's being fired by the Pocket Wizard Plus 3s, I'm getting all my exposure information from the meter. It really doesn't matter what flash I'm using. I could use anything. As I mentioned, I've got some Vivitar 283s that must be 25 years old at this point, and I still use them. Let's see. Okay, so someone asked if I could repeat, again, the difference between the stops. Somebody said, all right, so let's just an example. We're talking about F8 a lot. So F8 to 5.6 is one stop. 5.6 to F4 is two stops. F4 to 2.8 is three stops. Those are the full stop increments. You're going to find your camera is set in third stops. So it's probably going to read out F8, F7, F6.3, F5.6, F5, etc. But those numbers I just mentioned are the full stop increments. So 2.8 to 4, one stop. 4 to 5.6 is two stops. 5.6 to 8 is three stops. So that's how that works. Okay. Somebody asked where you set the ISO. That's an easy question. There's actually a button right on the front of the meter that says ISO. You just hold that in, spin the jog wheel, and you'll see the number changing in the upper right-hand corner of the meter. Somebody mentioned that their meter is metering, it seems to be metering too dark. It's possible your meter needs to be calibrated, or maybe it just needs to be calibrated to your camera. If that's the case, send us an email, and we can have that checked out. All right, let's continue on. So where were we? Yes, so going about covering light shaping tools, etc. Yes, I will use those, but I think you have to admit that with our one little speed light, just bare, from 8 to 10 feet away as we varied our contribution, we got pretty good results. I was really happy with them after I looked at them. And even though I personally favor the 20 to 30%, maybe leaning a little more heavily towards 30% contribution, after I started looking at those real dramatic lightings, the one where it was 80 and 90% flash, I actually started to like them. So, depends on the mood you're after. Okay, so let's move on to the next place. This is the toughest lighting situation we ran into. Subject in the shade, really bright sunlit background. Ratio is really extreme. In our next location, the shade was 3 stops, a little more than 3 stops darker than the background. When you've got a subject in shade and a bright background, if you're not using a flash, one of two things are going to happen. Either you're going to end up with a blown out background, your clouds in your sky are going to disappear, or you're going to end up with a face in really deep shadow, neither of which is going to look very good. Ideally, this is a lighting situation I would try to avoid. Try changing the direction you're looking in, maybe find a little bit more of a darker background to point at, or find some brighter shade on the border of the sunlight. Even better, move. Maybe get your subject underneath a tree right on that border between shade and sunlight. That's the kind of thing that'll help. As someone asked earlier, if you got mountains in the background with a backlit sun, it's going to make the flash contribution look a little more natural. Again, sometimes it's not possible. So I'd want to have some light shaping tools, some reflectors, maybe another light or two to add some more fill and create a better balance between the shade and the bright background. When you need to shoot in a lighting situation like this, you're going to have to supply a fairly large percentage of light from your flash to make up for that difference. That doesn't mean you can't get a good portrait. It does mean that the flash is going to be a little more obvious that it was used. So let's take a look at a situation where this was happening, and then we'll see how we can best deal with it. Now, while we were there, we also got out from underneath the shade and went out into the full sun. So you'll see a comparison of what happened. Take a look. So another situation that happens a lot. We're kind of in this pagoda thing, again, next to Belvedere Castle. And right behind us, we have the green duck pond. But this is a common situation where you've got somebody that's in shade and the area behind them is really bright. So how do you even that out? If I expose correctly for you, the background is just going to disappear. If I expose correctly for the background, you're going to be in deep shadow. So that's where we need to bring in the off-camera flash. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you right here, kind of looking back towards Rick, and I'm going to meter both the ambient light and the light on Bethany. So first for the light on Bethany, it's going to be pretty dim. She's in pretty deep shadow. And if I go up to 125th of a second, she's at 2.8. If I just step behind her, just out from underneath the pagoda, or 125th at f9. So what is that? 2.8 to 4 is one stop, 4 to 5.6 is 2, 5.6 to 8 is 3, to 9 is a third of a stop. That's 3 1/3 stops difference between here and the background. Now, since I know the background is at f9, remember, once again, we know our flash at a quarter power at 8 feet away is putting at f8 a light. That's going to put us right in the correct ballpark, because now the light hitting you from here is going to match what's back there. So Jen, let's go ahead and get you 8 feet away. So again, we're going to be 2 feet beyond there. Come a little closer, right there. So I'm going to go at my settings I just chose, 1/25th of a second at f9, which is what our background exposure is, and we're adding f8 of light to here. And it's a little flashy because we're adding so much light from the flash. In fact, let's check the contribution of the flash. Yeah, that's 80% flash. So, is there any way around that? Not really. When you've got that kind of contrast ratio, you're going to be kind of stuck with it. And it's okay. But we're asking the little flash to do too much, considering we have one little speed light. And again, as I said, we're trying to travel light. So that actually worked pretty well. I want to try to get as short a depth of field because there's a lot of detail back there I don't want. So we'll see what we can get away with. So first thing I'm going to do is take an ambient reading of the light on Bethany. So again, I'm going to have the dome out, and I want it kind of mirroring how the light's hitting her face. Doesn't matter if I'm pointing back at the camera or not, I just want to get this here. So I'm going to do just a straight ambient shot first. 160 at f10. All right, yeah, exposure's okay, but the dark side of her face is almost missing. So we're going to bring in the flash. Jen, right over here, because we want to fill in the shadow. Oh, I'm sorry. Poke the model in the eye if she doesn't cooperate. You can slap me. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to fill in the shadow side of her face and add a little light into her eyes. Now remember, we're at f8 from 6 feet away, and she's in f14. So we're going to need to either boost the power of the flash or get closer. So let's do the power first. So we were on 1/8 the power under that pagoda. We know a quarter power is f8. We're going to go to a half power. So let's do that. Half a power pointing right at Bethany, and about that far away. So let's point it right at her and let's see if that fills in our shadows enough. Much better. Now another thing, depth of field wise. You think you have to be at 2.8 to have a short depth of field, and that's not actually true. 2.8 will give you a short depth of field, but the bigger you put the subject in the viewfinder, the less depth of field you have. So I'm concerned about that background. I want it to be blurry. If I come in real close to Bethany, then that's going to be blurry even at f8 or f10. So at 100 ISO, I'm going to bring my shutter speed up to my highest flash sync, which is 250th of a second. And I'm getting 5.6 at 250 and 7.1 at 250. That's 2/3 of a stop. That's going to be much more gentle. So let's go ahead and bring our flash in. We're going to bring the power back down to 8th power on the flash. There we go. And nice. Beautiful, that's nice. Let me just get a couple shots. Very nice, that's working very nicely now. So this flash, this is a 30% flash contribution. And even though we've got people in the background, by kind of getting close, they're kind of soft focus. Okay, so let that be a lesson to you. First of all, unless you know the model really well, you're friends with it, don't touch your model, and definitely don't poke them in the eye. Okay, a couple questions just before we continue on. Somebody asked, can the 308 be set in 1/3 stop increments? The answer is absolutely. I don't have one right here with me, but again, if you turn it on, holding in the mode button, it actually goes through full stop, half stop, third stop. Those are the three choices. Someone asked about using exposure compensation and flash compensation getting the desired results. Some folks are really interested in that, particularly do TTL shooters. Again, I do everything when I'm shooting full manual. So exposure compensation and flash compensation never enter into the equation. I'm getting my information from here. I'm not playing around with the compensations on the camera. Whatever this tells me, that's the settings that get put in, and I get perfect exposures every time. Someone asked about, will the Pocket Wizard Plus 3 work with any hot shoe on any Nikon or Canon camera without a cable? And the answer is yes. It's just a single pin. I don't know if you can see it there. It's a single pin. Any camera that's got a center firing pin in its hot shoe will work. I understand there are a couple of new cameras that have that center pin offset, so they may not work with this. If you're not sure, go on a Pocket Wizard's website. It's just pocketwizard.com, and they have a compatibility list there. Somebody asked about high-speed sync, if you got a background real bright. Subject for another day. The Pocket Wizard Plus 3s that we're dealing with are limited to the flash sync of the camera, the standard flash sync, meaning in most cases a 250th of a second. For that real high-speed sync flash, that is something that is the domain of the Pocket Wizard Mini and Flex. Again, a subject for another day. I have done some programs on that, and we will have some more coming up in the future. Let's see, anything else? Somebody asked what lens and camera was I using. Here it is, Canon 7D, Canon 24 to 72/8 lens. Let's see. Oh, someone asked about mixing ambient flash. Is custom white balance absolutely necessary, or can you use auto white balance? Me personally, I always stay away from auto white balance. I'll pick a color temperature because I don't want a variability there. Typically, I'll have it set for daylight. If I'm in daylight, I have it set for shade if I'm in shade. But I will always take a picture of the color checker so that I have a reference for color. Let's see. A couple of you were having some issues with specific meter questions. Something seems to be going wrong with that. For those of you, we'll give you the tech support number to talk to. They can go over through the manual with you, through the steps, step by step. Let's see. Okay, so somebody again asked about how do you figure out this flash contribution manually? And I kind of briefly touched on that. Let me just go over it one more time. Again, if you don't have a meter that's going to tell you the actual flash contribution, you do need to know what your flash is putting out. So again, I went 8 feet, quarter power, f8 at 160 ISO. I know that. Using that as a setting, I take my ambient light reading. So let's say, for example, I take a reading and I get 1/25th of a second at f11. Knowing that my flash is putting out f8, that's one stop less. So that means it's putting out, if you add them all together, I've got f11 from my ambient, f8 from my flash. It's half the amount of light, but there's two f11s, since it's twice as much, and my f8. That's going to actually equal out to about, technically, 33%. You can say 30% to be safe. If you find that a little hot, and you want to back it off a little bit, backing off one full step with your flash to the subject is generally going to change it by 10% increments. If you want a little bit more, take one step closer, and it's going to increase by 10%. Having a meter eliminates that guesswork. But if you do test your flash with various different power settings, maybe with a light shaper, and just learn at 8 to 10 feet what it's putting out, then you can calculate those percentages manually as well. It's just a lot easier to have the meter to do it. Okay, let's see. Okay, here's a good question. This really confused somebody. How did I not overexpose when I changed the shutter speed from 1/80th at 6.3 to 1/20th at 6.3? The reason I didn't overexpose is because, again, remember, my flash contribution, which was putting out 6.3 basically, hadn't changed. It's putting out the same regardless of the shutter speed. What the shutter speed is changing is the ambient light. My ambient light reading was actually way below a 20th of a second at 6.3. It was very dark in there. I think we measured it and it was, at 20th of a second, it was something like 2.8. So even though I kept opening up the shutter speed, the background was just getting lighter. The reason it didn't overexpose is because I never went above what the ambient reading was, and the flash contribution on the subject absolutely stayed the same. All right, so we're just about out of time, so we got a couple more things to cover. Going back to the video you just saw, you might have noticed that we ended up getting better results when we moved out from under the shade and actually into direct sunlight. In the direct sunlight, we just needed to add enough flash to fill in the shadows under the eyes, under the chin a bit, and it really produced beautiful results. And remember, those images were just bare flash. It's actually a really nice way to create a great fill flash results because we've only got 20 to 30% contribution there. Yes, in that situation, you can get similar results with a reflector, but you have less control over the catch lights. What you end up is having some kind of big giant catch light in the eye, which maybe not look that great. So let's move on to our last situation. We're going to have our subject again in bright sunlight. This time, different color backgrounds. We've got one with a really dark background and one with a light background. And again, you're going to see just adding 20% or so fill flash is going to make a world of difference. So here's the process I would use again. As I mentioned, take that meter reading with your ambient light. If you get 1/60th of a second at f16, I know my flash is putting out 8. How many stops down from 16 is 8? Well, when you're doing fill flash outside, you're probably going to want it to be 1.5 to 2 stops less than your ambient reading. So f8 to f11 is 1 stop, f11 to f16 is 2 stops. So again, knowing my light is putting out f8 at 8 feet away, with f16 as my ambient, that's going to contribute about 20 to 25%. It's going to be perfect. If you need more light on the subject in that case, then, and you can't get any closer, then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to increase the power on your flash unit. So let's get this finished up. We're going to take one last visit to New York City. This time we crossed all the way across the park, and we went to the plaza in the middle of Lincoln Center. Again, 2 interesting backgrounds, one with a dark pool and sculpture, the second with a bright white fountain. The meter was really valuable in these situations because the camera's meter was very fooled by those backgrounds. When it saw the black background, it wanted to overexpose the scene. When we had the bright white fountain, it wanted to underexpose. Being able to measure the flash contribution also gave us the information we needed to get consistent and beautiful results. Take a look. We're in Lincoln Center here in Uptown New York, and we've got one of the plazas with one of the sculptures behind us. So we're going to throw a little action this time, and I'm going to do a shot first with my metering result with no light, no extra light. So I take my meter reading, and at 100 ISO, I'm getting 162nd at f10. So I'll just put that in the camera, and that'll be it. Then we're just going to add a little bit to it. We're going to bring a flash over kind of close, just because the sun's kind of overhead and we've got some shadows on this side of Bethany's face, just to open that up a little bit and do that. So since I'm at f10, if I have my flash, remember my flash is f8 at 8 feet away, so if I just add that f8, it's going to be a perfect amount to fill in that shadow. And Bethany's going to have to work for this one too, because we asked her to actually do a little. Since we're right over across from the ballet house, she's going to do her ballet impression. So let's see how that works out.
Bear with me.
Okay. Higher.
Higher. Yeah.
You know what? All right. I'll get lower. That'll make you look higher by me getting lower. Okay.
Good?
Yep, go ahead. Got Jen with the flash. Flash is going to be a 20% contribution, just enough to fill in some shadows, add a little bright to the catch light. And I will get down lower, so Bethany doesn't cause a stir. So you're going to be right over the sign.
Right over it.
Yep. Okay, ready when you are. Up. We got to work on your form. Because your hair kept blowing in your face. All right. All right, go ahead. Point it right at her face. Okay, whenever you're ready. Nice. Okay, we got it. So we're going to move over to the fountain. We have a kind of a backlight on Bethany, and we've got a difference here in our readings. So I'm going to go back up to 160 ISO, get that 2/3 of the stop back. So I've got 125 at f10. If I come to the back of her head where the sun is hitting, I'm getting 400 at f10. So that's almost 2 stops, just short of 2 stops. So that's kind of a lot to overcome without making it look very flashy again. So let's see what we can do. It's going to be okay if I overexpose this a little bit. So I'm going to overexpose this by 1 stop so that it just makes 2/3 of a stop difference between the foreground and the background. So let me get my reading here again. So 125, let's bring the flash in. So come on a little closer. Let's get you right about, let's do it from this side. So about right there, let's get a reading. Actually, huh? Where'd our fountain go? Well, wait, okay. So I got 160 at f11. It's a 30% flash contribution. Perfect. That should be really perfect. So we'll take us a couple of shots and hope that the fountain's coming back. All right. So 160 at f11 is 30% flash. Nice. Yeah, and you were, without the flash, she is completely in shadow. So that 30% flash contribution, since she's slightly backlit by the sun, makes an absolute world of difference. And having the meter, you need that. You need the 358 or a 758 to tell you what that percentage of flash is. Because that's the only way you're going to figure it out. There's no other way. All right, the fountain's coming back. Let me take a shot without flash again. Yeah, Jen, flash again. Right at her chin, down a little lower. There we go. World of difference. One more. And that's it. It's that simple. I love it when you guys ask wise guy questions. So you want to see me ballet dance, huh? No, you really don't. You don't want to see me do any kind of dancing. Trust me on that. Okay, a couple quick questions because I know I'm running over. Let's get these answered. Someone said if you're shooting raw, does it matter how you have your white balance set? Technically, no. It really doesn't because you can set it after the fact. However, if I have my white balance set correctly, the image that shows on the back of the camera is going to be more accurate because the image on the back of the camera is a JPEG that is processed using whatever current settings you have in your camera. So if you have the white balance set correctly, you're just going to get a better representation. Not that I judge final image on my camera. I mostly use that for composition reasons, but it does give you a sense if there's a problem with color. Someone asked if high contrast scene, can you add a neutral density filter to darken the background? Yeah, but it's going to darken everything equally, so it's really not going to help you. Let's see. Oh, good question. And your flash is on a stand. Let's say you don't have the lovely Jen with you to act as your voice-activated light stand. Where do you point it? Do I point it at the face, above the face, etc.? Good question. Typically, if I'm doing a portrait that's going to be maybe a head and shoulders shot, I'll typically point the flash high chest, neck area. I don't point it at the face unless I'm looking for that fall off. You might have noticed when we were under the shade and I was doing some full lengths, I had Jen actually rotate the flash so that the flash head was vertical to give me a little more spread in that direction. But generally, when I'm shooting from 8 feet away, I'm generally pointing the flash about right here. Someone asked if your ambient reading is 100th at 5.6, for example, and you want to underexpose the ambient a stop while using the flash, what's the difference between setting the camera at 1/200th at 5.6 or 100th at f8? No difference. They're exactly the same amount of exposure. It's going to affect your depth of field a little bit. Other than that, they're the same. And let's see, just about lastly, someone asked, can you use the camera's meter in spot modes to substitute for a handheld meter? You really can't. You can use a spot mode on your camera if you don't have a 758 and you're trying to gauge the brightest highlight in your image, which is, again, a subject for another day. But it's still reflected versus ambient light. It's still going to be determined by what it is you're pointing at, so you really can't do that. Let's see. So somebody asked, why am I not using the 758 and metering out of the eyepiece, which is what you do when you're looking through here. That's for spot metering. I use that when I'm doing landscape photography, not portraits. For ambient light metering, you don't look through here, you just use the dome. All right, let me finish up because I've run way over time. I really appreciate your questions. Remember, your camera's meter can only measure the light reflected back through the lens. Reflected light is going to be influenced by your clothing and the skin, the color tone of the surrounding elements in the scene, and in addition, it cannot measure flash and ambient separately. You've seen today the consistent results we were able to get because we relied on this handheld meter to measure the light sources illuminating our subject. Consistency is the key here, and one of the things that separates a pro from an amateur is consistency. The bottom line is that using a light meter like a 358 or a 758 or even a 308 or if you have an older 508, it gives you the information you need to understand how the light in any scene, be it ambient, flash, or a combination of both, is illuminating your subject. Now, I hope this has helped to clear up some of the mystery of blending flash and ambient light. Take a little time to practice. Learn how your flash puts out light, so this will start to become second nature. Simply knowing how much light your flash puts out at a fixed distance and power is going to go a long way to getting you started. If you don't have one yet, think about investing in a handheld light meter that will give you the information you need to truly evaluate and control the light on your subject. When you have control of the light, you're free to concentrate on your subject, and that will allow you to create the beautiful portraits your clients will love. And by the way, that's what results in both increased sales and happy customers. Now, there's still a lot to talk about, a lot more to explore concerning metering and lighting. Our next session on environmental portraiture will take what we covered today and expand these concepts and capabilities with multiple lights, reflectors, and light shaping tools to really create studio quality portraits anywhere. So until next time, get out there and shoot. Learn how your equipment responds and capture the best image and moment possible. That's really one of the true joys of photography. So until next time, thanks for watching.